Um, I welcome all of you to the talk organized by the Seminar Committee of Department of History, Delhi University. Today's talk is by Professor Dr. Aparna Balachandran. She's a historian of modern India, and her research and teaching interests include early British colonialism in South India, legal history, urban history, and histories of visuality and commemorative practices. Besides the politics and practices of archiving in colonial and post-colonial India. Dr. Balachandran did her BA and MA in history from the University of Delhi, MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and PhD from Columbia University in New York. She has co-edited a volume entitled Iterations of Law, Legal Histories from India, and co-written a book, Archive and Access, History, Technology, and Archiving Practices in India. She is currently in the process of completing a monograph on early colonial law and urbanism in the city of Madras and co-writing a book on collective memory, materiality, and history. She has received a number of research grants, including from Charles Wallace India Trust, the British Academy, the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History, and the University of New South Wales. Currently, she is also the book reviewers editor for South Asian Studies, the Journal of the British Association of South Asian Studies. Dr. Aparna Balachandran is speaking today on Religion and the Everyday, the Protestant Soundscape of Early Colonial Madras. We welcome her and also invite Professor Amar Farooqi to chair this lecture. Over to Professor Farooqi.
Thank you. And I don't think we'll waste any time and request Dr. Aparna Balachandran to speak on religion and the everyday, the Protestant soundscape of early colonial Madras. Dr. Balachandran.
Just a second. 1 second. I'm just trying to get my, okay. Thank you to Razi and the seminar committee for this invitation to speak here today. And I also want to thank Amar for chairing this session. Thank you, Amar. Today, I am very tentatively sharing some new work on sound and modernity in early colonial Madras. This is a true COVID project with no access to an archive for about 2 years or so. I went back to the records that I already had with me and tried to look at that material in a different way, about which I will say more in my presentation. I also found that for the sources that I'm looking at, that is 19th century Protestant missionary records, open access digitized collections on the internet are considerable, and that was a happy discovery. So in this paper, I discussed the soundscape. In this paper, I discussed the soundscape of the Protestant missionary enterprise in the Tamil region of South India in the first half of the 19th century. What did Protestant, more specifically Anglican missionaries, hear in their everyday lives? How did sound allow them to know and understand themselves and the world around them? How did it structure their social and political relationships and imaginations? My understanding of hearing is not as a physiological phenomenon alone, but as one that is contingent, contextual, and embedded in relations of power. As a large and growing corpus of work by sensory historians tell us, there is no transcendent universal meaning to any of the senses, shaped as they are by the historical particularities of political and cultural contexts. In recent years, historians of sound have questioned the teleological assumption that modern life is marked by the hegemony of the visual, the domination of sight over all other senses. This literature has enabled explorations of how hearing and the other senses, separately and collectively, played a crucial role in the constitution of the modern. These historians argue that rather than becoming marginal to human experience, the meaning and significance of sound has changed over time, and that history, in some part, continues to be determined by struggles at the level of the oral, even as these sites themselves are produced by the specificities of different historical moments and cultures. As far as South Asian history is concerned, with a few notable exceptions, most studies of sound and modernity have focused on music and in particular, the relationship between nationalism and the making of musical traditions. There are several important recent exceptions. For instance, there's Navida Khan's well-known analysis of the impact of loudspeakers on Muslim religiosity in Pakistan, Bani Bates' work on Protestant oratory and Tamil politics, or Vibhuti Duggal's recent research on the histories of radio and broadcasting in India. Now, these arguments about the centrality of sound to modern political and social life, undergird this paper. While print and literacy were undoubtedly central to the Anglican missionary project, sound, as much as sight, was an intrinsic part of their lived experience in the 19th century. The control, regulation, and the hierarchization of sound was crucial to the missionary understanding of what it was to be Christian, both for themselves and for the native convert. As we shall see, the realm of the sonic, articulated in religious terms, allowed Anglican missionaries to negotiate the complex political terrain of early colonialism in South India that was characterized by multiple claimants to power and authority in the region. How does the historian listen? What is an archive of sound, particularly at a time before the advent of recording technology? To write this paper, I returned to what to me were the familiar records of the 19th century Protestant archive from South India, but with a new awareness of the missionary as the listening subject. I soon found that when I looked at written sources with the express purpose of finding the sonic, I was overwhelmed by its ubiquity, whether it was voice, music, or non-human sounds. These were not the product of spectacular moments, but were a part of the everyday life of the mission in South India. These records were suffused with noise, so much that I was left wondering why I had never noticed these in the past. But how does one make sense of this plenitude beyond the acknowledgement that sound was an important part of the consciousness of the English missionary in the 17th century? Mark Smith, who was a historian of 19th century America, has argued that historians cannot study all sound in the archive. They have to focus on certain specific ones, and crucially, provide the context within which these were perceived and captured in narrative prose. At the same time, if sound is not to be reduced to just any cultural or social artifact, then the act of sonic retrieval has to also pay attention to the acoustics of the archive, the tone and quality of voices, the natural environment, constructed space, and material objects, all of which produce oral effects that human beings interact with. What the Anglican missionary heard in 19th century Madras was both cultural and physiological, and it is that crucial intersection that the historian of sound seeks to probe. Thus, this paper will look at descriptions of what missionaries would call heathen religious practices in the colonial city of Madras in the early 19th century. The records that I will analyze were not meant for public consumption in the colony. That is to say, they are not the books, pamphlets, and other printed matter that was circulated in order to draw potential native converts to Christianity. Instead, they consist of material that was meant to draw funding and recruits from England, but which also circulated among Protestant missionaries in different parts of the world. The tone of this archive was more private, confidential, and intimate, with missionaries speaking with each other to bolster their confidence, faith in the mission, and to strengthen a sense of self in what were often inhospitable contexts. These narratives reflect the nature of missionary work, quotidian and endlessly repetitive. They contain tropes and themes that underline the centrality of sound and the missionaries' listening ear to the Protestant enterprise. I will argue in this paper that the rhetorical act of distancing from native sound in Madras was key to fashioning oneself as a Christian in a fraught political context marked by multiple claims to religious truth and political power. Here, the creation of a Christian oral environment was a necessary condition for the salvation of the native convert. The presence of Roman Catholic churches and worshippers in this region complicated this issue, and we will see that the realm of the oral became the key site to assert Protestantism as the only true Christian faith. The first section of my paper is called The Sounds of Salvation, Temple Noises and Missionary Anxieties. I'm going to start with an excerpt from a letter published in a collection of reports by the Church Missionary Society in 1843. It contains the account of a female mission worker describing a temple festival in Blacktown, that part of Madras largely populated by locals. The letter is not by the mission worker herself, but by someone who professes a deep knowledge of her feelings at the scene she encountered. So this is a rather large excerpt, but the twists and turns of its narrative are really quite illuminating. So I'll just begin. One of these temples stands opposite the windows of the mission house. One day, a lady who was there had heard enough through the whole day the great noise of tom-toms, a rude kind of drum, and shouting, but this occurs so frequently that it did not particularly attract her attention, till towards evening the noise became even worse than usual, and she thought she heard an explosion. On looking towards the pagoda, the temple, she saw crowds of people, men, women, and children standing on the steps of the tank. Some were beating tom-toms, others were waving lighted torches, for it was beginning to get dark, and all shouting and evidently taking the greatest interest in the scene. The glare of the torches at times threw so bright a light upon the various groups that she could plainly distinguish them, and then everything for a while would be enveloped in smoke, except the upper part of the tower of the pagoda and a beautiful coconut tree that is near the tank. At intervals, rockets were fired off, and altogether the noise and clamor were more than you can well imagine. And what was it all for? It was their annual ceremony of taking their senseless idol out of its shrine and putting it on a raft when, surrounded by priests and dancing girls, it was to be dragged around the tank and then carried back to its dark recess. See now, dear friends, the delightful contrast between this idolatrous rioting and the simple Christian service held in the chapel next door. Just then, she heard the sound of the bell from the little mission chapel at the end of the garden, and turning around, saw it lighted up and remembered that it was Wednesday evening, when there is always divine service in Tamil for the converted natives. Her spirit was comforted and encouraged as she watched a few quietly going in, one by one, and presently the sound of singing burst upon her ear. The service was beginning, and praise and prayer to Jehovah rose from the lips, which had no missionary ever visited southern India would have been shouting at the temple of the idol. Now, before we turn to this text, let us look at the context in which it was written, an urban public arena marked by heated debates carried out in print and verbal confrontations between Hindu polemicists and Christian missionaries in the city. By this time, this is the 1840s we're talking about, there was a substantial number of Anglican missionaries in Madras. As all of you know, the Charter Act that had been passed in the British Parliament included a pious clause that made it substantially easier for Protestant missionaries to travel to and work in India. These missions were but the latest in a long line of European Christians, both Protestant and Roman Catholic in South India, but they distinguished themselves from their predecessors through their rejection of heathen culture, including crucially the institution of caste. There was growing anger on the part of upper caste Hindus at Christian proselytizing that was accompanied by increasing numbers of conversions of low castes and untouchables to Christianity. So by the 1840s, the city of Madras was the center of a war of polemics. Organizations of upper caste Hindus regularly sent petitions to the Madras government at Fort St. George, complaining about the activities of Protestant missionaries, as well as publishing anti-Christian literature to counter the flood of Christian propaganda that was brought out by mission presses. And here this brings us to the importance of the colonial urban space for the historian, and why it is that although Anglican missionaries traveled and worked throughout the Tamil region, my focus is specifically on Madras city, as the site of these heated disputes between religious groups, as well as the focus of control and regulation by the East India Company. It's the urban archive which is really suffused with these sonic encounters. Now, missionary propaganda directed at the native population, whether detractors or potential converts, does not exhaust the kind of records produced by the Anglican mission in India. The missionary archive is also replete with other kinds of texts, descriptions, observations, and ethnographic vignettes that were produced for a domestic audience in the form of appeals for funds and support, as well as to those contemplating a career in the Anglican missions in different parts of the world. And this is something that I spoke about in the introduction. Historians have argued that these texts were meant to produce affective communities of mission that were predicated on a racialized distinction between European and colonized population. At the heart of this discursive enterprise was emotion that served to establish and reinforce hierarchies of race, power, and gender. These texts contain language that represented Indians in emotional, intimately charged ways that appealed to the reader's sense of Christian purpose and agency. What is also notable and perhaps less remarked upon is that sound was an essential part of the construction of the emotion of these texts, that the oral was central to the production of the native subject as culturally and intellectually inferior on the one hand, but importantly capable of being rescued by the Christian mission on the other. Thus, the writings of missionary authors in 19th century Madras was marked by a narrative device whereby native sound was juxtaposed with European Christian sound, the former being aesthetically and spiritually inferior, but that was capable of being rescued by the latter. The Anglican Mission Archive is replete with such texts, and the extract above that I just quoted is one such example, a particularly striking example. So interestingly, the text gives no sense of the context in which it was composed, of the contentious environment marked by the bitter exchange of words between missionaries and their detractors. Instead, it appears timeless, an ethnographic vignette unmarked by politics or controversy. So returning to the text then, to the extract that I began this section with. The letter is not written in the first person, as we know, but describes a woman watching a temple festival from the window of the mission house located in Blacktown, Madras, a fact that manages to convey her authenticity as witness to the scene, as well as distancing her from what she gazes at. This is a quintessential missionary text, replete with ethnographic details about native religious practices and suffused with affect. It is also viscerally sensorial, invoking the scene before the woman in rich visual and oral description. As important as the visual, that is the temple lit by blinding lights and crowded with worshippers, dancing prostitutes and heathen priests, is the unfamiliar oral, with the din of drums beating, people shouting, and lit firecrackers. Now, on the one hand, this is of course a classic example of an Orientalist description of a world that the disapproving viewer does not understand. But here it's also shot through with an all-pervasive sense of sadness and melancholy at the degraded character of the religious ritual that she witnesses. This scene is in sharp contrast to another that is enacted nearby. So the scene then shifts and you have the second sight, right? So that is native Christians attending the service at the mission chapel. The difference between the raucous sounds of heathenism and that of Christian noise, the ringing of the church bell, the service, voices raised in song and prayer, are essential to communicate the depravity of the first and the goodness of the activities in the second vignette. The work of the text, however, was not merely to communicate disgust or revulsion. Instead, it was to suggest to the reader that change was possible, that the hardworking and devoted missionary could transform the first scene into the second one, that the sounds of heathenism could give way to that of the Christian faith. What were in fact the sounds that the woman at the mission window was exposed to? What she saw and heard was in all probability the Periyamelam and the Chinnamelam ensembles, which are associated with temple festivals and rituals in South India. And the Periyamelam continues to exist today and consists of male musicians, male instrumentalists, and the Chinnamelam consisted of temple dancing women, Devadasis, who were linked to temple establishments that provided them employment and protection. Although other instruments are also associated with the Periyamelam, its most important ones are the Nadaswaram, or the double reed aerophone, and the Tawal, that is the double-headed drum. Accompanied by the Tawal keeping time, the Nadaswaram is an instrument of great power and volume and is therefore played in the outdoors on auspicious occasions like weddings and temple festivals, when the deity was taken around the temple tank, followed by processions of worshippers. The music produced by the Nadaswaram was the sonic manifestation of the deity, the sound enabling the hearer to experience the divine even without seeing the god or goddess of the temple directly. Now, what's interesting here is that while an important sentiment expressed by this text is that of the strangeness of these native sounds, they were in fact not likely to be unfamiliar ones. For one thing, native musical instruments were regularly co-opted into civic rituals and functions by the Madras government, and fireworks were a standard feature of celebrations held by city officials. The sounds themselves, therefore, were made strange by their context and were not inherently alien to the hearer. Now, what distinguishes the missionary text from other European accounts of sounds associated with Indian religious ceremonies and rituals is that the emotion communicated is not merely that of astonishment, disapproval, or disgust. Here, there is always the potential of salvation that would allow for the displacement of heathen sounds with Protestant ones, that is, of the organ, church bells, and the speech of missionaries and priests. At the same time, missionary texts also speak of a second kind of oral experience that is the mark of a true Christian, and that is that of silence. The extract from the missionary letter, thus, speaks warmly of the noises emanating from the little native church, but it also talks about the calm of the worshippers. Silence was necessary for comprehension and understanding, the quiet essential to hear and absorb the word of God. Anglican missionaries wrote often of their relief and happiness when they encountered what they believed were attentive and absorbed audiences marked by noiselessness that allowed it to concentrate on the missionaries' words, that allowed the audience to concentrate on the missionaries' words. I'm going to end this section with another extract, this time from 1838, when a well-known missionary, J.E. Nimmo, spoke of a successful trip that he and his assistants took to preach to the natives in Kumbakonam town. The theme is a familiar one of tireless missionaries setting out to preach to native audiences, amongst whom there were many detractors. And again, the quotation is sort of self-explanatory. So let me just read it out. Having attended all this forenoon to some mission business at home, in the afternoon, we again went to the town. A few of my assistants I sent in another direction, and they reported, with the exception of a few Brahmins who opposed them, that their other hearers heard them attentively. We next went to the schoolroom. Here my assistant read a tract, and I preached to a large and attentive congregation. About the middle of my sermon, I was interrupted by a few Brahmins again, who appeared to be violent. However, my other hearers interfered and soon put our opposers to silence. The silence and attention of my hearers during the whole of my discourse was indeed remarkable. So this is just a short account of a successful venture to preach to a native audience in the town of Kumbakonam. Okay, I'm going to turn to my second and final section now, which is entitled Catholicism and the Sounds of Paganism. And once again, I begin with an extract from a missionary journal, this time from the 1850s. And this extract details a Catholic festival at one of the important Portuguese churches in Madras, St. Thomas. And I quote, "The Romish celebrated their annual feast on Thomas's Mount. They carried wooden images of Simon, Christ, and Mary around the mount, accompanied by heathen music, pariah harlots attired like the heathen dancing harlots belonging to the pagodas. The Portuguese call it the Feast of Our Dear Lady of the Mount, the Malabar Christians call it the Mother Feast, and the heathen call it the Feast of the Hill God. Decent people amongst the Romish begin to be ashamed of such disorder and abomination and would have the feast done away with. But the Romish Christians say that they would sooner cease to be Christians than to be deprived of their feast." Hindus and Muslims were not the only religious groups that Anglican missionaries had to contend with in 19th century Madras. From its very beginnings in the 17th century, the port city was a socially, racially, and linguistically heterogeneous space that included substantial numbers of Roman Catholic Christians, both native and European. The city was home to a large number of Christians who mainly belonged to low and outcast laboring groups resident in the city and were affiliated to the Portuguese church or the French Capuchin mission churches in Madras. Exacerbated by the 7 Years' War, the anti-Catholic sentiment in England spilled over into its overseas settlements like Madras, where the French, Portuguese, and English wrestled for supremacy through the 18th century. However, the nature of early colonial governance rendered the Madras government's relationship with its Catholic institutions and population a complex one. Historians have pointed out that in spite of the East India Company's self-avowed stance as religiously neutral, it was in fact Protestant in vision and character, and saw itself as the Christian guardian of a religiously diverse mercantile space, success in which endeavor would ensure both commercial profits and the moral well-being of the city. The issue of the jurisdiction of the Madras government over these Catholic institutions remained a controversial one. Much to the chagrin of the Catholic clergy, the East India Company became the arbiter of the financial and property disputes that frequently broke out in these spaces in the 18th and the 19th centuries. The role of the Madras government was, however, not just restricted to so-called secular matters. By the early 19th century, a series of disputes broke out between low caste worshippers and the European ecclesiastical authorities in the Catholic churches in the city. Native Christians went above their clergy and petitioned the East India Company to intervene in these conflagrations. As a result, the Protestant government was well and truly entrenched as a key decision maker in matters involving Catholic belief and practice, ranging from the selection of caste headmen to matters involving the conduct of ceremonies and rituals. As the numbers of Anglican missionaries increased in the city in the first few decades of the 19th century, they expressed deep shock at what they saw as the involvement of the Madras government in the ceremonial and ritual affairs of the Roman Catholic Church in South India, which they equated with paganism and its social and cultural practices, including that of caste. So the quotation taken above from a missionary record detailing a Roman Catholic feast in Santhome in Madras is a very familiar one, expressing disgust at the similarities of these Catholic functions and feasts and processions with Hindu temple festivals. Now, while some Anglicans did suggest that as problematic as it was, Catholicism was after all Christian and could not be seen as equivalent to heathenism, the mainstream view, the majority view was that Catholicism's idolatry and ritualism, the borrowing of pagan ceremonies, and above all, the retention of caste, all rendered it unworthy of support and patronage from a Protestant government. Thus, even while the power and influence of Catholicism declined in Madras, its denunciation and equation of paganism became extremely important. In so doing, and again we come back to these texts, a common narrative ploy in missionary texts was to describe a deeply sensorial experience that was heavily dependent on hearing and devoid of actual visual evidence. The hearer would then assume that what he was listening to was sounds emanating from a Hindu festival or ceremony, the end of the anecdote revealing that these were in fact Roman Catholic. For instance, in 1855, the missionary John Dulles wrote at length about an afternoon when he could see flashes of light and sound in the sky from his home in Royapuram in Blacktown, Madras. So Royapuram, you have a very well-known low caste Capuchin church in Royapuram in Blacktown. And John Dulles writes about seeing, from over his wall, he could see these flashes of light and sound in the sky, which alerted him to a fact that there was a festival going on. So thus, according to Dulles, flashes of brilliant flames shot up from torches and rockets and other fireworks threw glittering globes into the air with loud explosion. From the clangor of the Hindu music that accompanied the explosion of fireworks, I took it to be a heathen wedding procession. It was only later that Dulles realized that what he had encountered was a procession from a Roman Catholic church, complete with native musicians with drums, fifes, and tom-toms, as well as adorned Christian figures like that of Saint Peter and Mary, as well as fireworks. While seeing had ultimately revealed that the ruckus had been caused through Christian, albeit Catholic agency, the ear, that is sound, had shown the truth of the situation, that there was no real difference between Roman Catholicism and paganism. This reification of sound as truth, right? That the eye will lie, but sound is truth. The reification of sound as truth is an oft repeated theme in other texts from that time. In her very famous memoirs, Julia Maitland, an English woman visiting India, describes a scene at a temple as she sat sketching from a distance. Now, Maitland's account is particularly interesting because it does not contain any visual details. It is entirely based on what she heard through the walls of the temple. She writes of her experience, stating that there was music and the mumbling chants of old priests who could not sing, and the shrill voice of the choir boys, and at intervals a little bell tinkling, till it was all interrupted by violent screams from girls' voices. Perhaps they were meant for singing, but they sounded very horrible. Then came the loud beating of drums and the ringing of bells, and it was all finished. It all sounded, claimed Maitland, like a Roman Catholic service. Once again, the invocation of the sonic allowed the Anglican Protestant to distance herself from Roman Catholicism, just as she did from heathenism. Okay, I'm just going to sum up now. So what this paper has attempted to do is to read missionary texts from the first half of the 19th century to apprehend the sonic landscape of Anglican missionaries in South India, focusing on the colonial port city of Madras. It argues that in the political and social tumult of the time, a central way in which Anglican missionaries made sense of themselves and their world was through the realm of the sonic. They categorized and classified the heterogeneous religious world they encountered, producing hierarchies by comparing and contrasting different varieties of religious sounds with that of Anglicanism. And my aim here is not merely to state that the European encounter with the colonized was not merely one that was apprehended in visual terms. It is also to suggest that at a time before the ascendancy of sight, sound was essential to self-understanding and to action. What Anglican missionaries in Madras heard enabled them to navigate and intervene in the complex political, religious, and social terrain of their times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this extremely interesting talk. I would ask Professor Farooqi if he would like to make some comments.
Perhaps I'll make some one or two observations I have a little later, and we'll begin by inviting questions, comments, remarks from the audience. Thank you, Aparna. This was fascinating because this is not really something about which my own sort of knowledge is very limited. This field that's opening up on the history of sound, particularly in the context of India. And I think, you know, that the way in which the Protestant missionaries provided detail about you know, practices in the temple in the neighborhood which you talked about. I think, you know, it comes out of a particular understanding of which was very important actually to the Reformation, and I have something to say on that later, which was very important to the Reformation about how churches should be built in a way that the acoustics are suited to the mode of worship.
Yes.
And I think, you know, that's why they paid such close attention to the way in which temples, you know, their acoustics, their sound, and the detailing, I think, you know, is the attention to detail is, I think, you know, very, very significant. But we'll come back to that and we'll invite questions. I think Deborah had raised her hand. So please, I think the seminar committee will take over.
Sure, sir. Are there any questions? In the In the
Please,
meantime, perhaps I had one question for ma'am.
Yeah, sure.
I also have some interest in the missionary work. I was wondering whether there is some mention regarding the gospel music of the Christians, specifically in context of whether, uh, as you've already mentioned, the kind of instruments that were used were not alien, but the context of them was something that was specifically found not supported by the missionaries. But I was wondering whether when a lot of Christian gospel music was set to Indian tunes, was there a conscious attempt to perhaps keep certain kinds of instruments away from those or certain tunes, or was there an attempt, perhaps, if that's something in the archive that you could find?
Yeah. Should I respond?
Yes, ma'am. In the meantime, I'm sure we'll have more questions.
Okay. So thank you. I'll just start by responding to Amar. And I would love to know more about churches during the Reformation and the acoustics of churches, because what I found in my records is that there is so much attention that these church builders, that these missionaries, early missionaries, paid to the question of acoustics. So where do the pipe organs have to be placed in order so that they can be best heard? Where is the priest to stand so that he can be best heard, etc., etc. So there's a lot of attention paid to acoustics, and particularly, and a lot of attention paid to the bell. That, and they would their money would be spent to bring these bells from England to Madras, and there was a great deal of, and of course. And what is interesting, of course, is that the sound of these bells was distinguished from the sound of the temple bells, which they would hear all the time, right? So there's a certain kind of materiality which is which is associated with these religious sounds, and this question of acoustics, I think, it's very important, and that's something I want to look at further. Coming to this question that Abhijit asked about music. So I think the big issue is really about, for the music became a very, very important site of contention for these missionaries. The Anglicans, many of the Anglicans were against using native music at all, right? So you had certain very hardcore Anglicans who said you should not use native music at all. But there was some important missionaries, including Samuel Metir, who was in Travancore, who said, okay, let's use native music, let's use the form of native music and set them to Christian lyrics, right? So this actually becomes a source of much contention amongst different kinds of Protestant missionaries about, what the role that music is to play in spreading the word. So people like Renius, who is very important in the Church Missionary Society, would say no music at all is to be used. So, and whereas people like Metir would argue that if although this is if the music is if you take out the religious content of this music and you fill it with Christian lyrics, that's what they would say, it would be all right? So that you could then use music to spread the word of Christ. So music became actually a source of much controversy amongst the Protestants. Right. So on the one hand, of course, the Roman Catholics, the Jesuits, etc., would use native music all the time in their feasts and ceremonies and rituals, and so did the Lutherans. But the Protestants were divided about what is religious sound? Does it include the sound of the instruments themselves? Can you replace? There are many debates about if you replace the lyrics with Christian lyrics, then is it all right? So what is the role that music? What role is music to play in proselytization? So I didn't talk about that, but so the extract that I sort of read out from, the long extract, was from the Church Missionary Society. But you have but music is the source of much sort of controversy at this time. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Are there any other questions from people here questions or comments they'd like to make. I think that's all. Professor Faruqi, did you? Okay.
I think Dr. Yasir Arakat, I think had he said yes. Maybe he has a question or a comment. Yasir?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, Aparna, thank you. Oh, thank you for that wonderful talk. So I don't have questions or something, and I have a kind of an observation because somehow feel that all this all these things and whatever you're talking about. So I mean, created a kind of kind of clash of acoustic so in South India. So that is what in fact somehow that is the feeling I'm getting now. So this was happening. This clash of acoustics actually, because it was happening in Kerala, and particularly in the 19th century, where one finds a range of say acoustic activists from different pietistic and missionary polemicists. So what I'm feeling that what was the nature of these acoustic tensions in the 19th century, where when you have this acoustic intimacy or sonic intimacy emerges a major conduit for community or kinship related activities. Of course, it was happening in Tamil Nadu, so it was happening in Kerala. So and I also want to know what was the gender of this acoustic, and so the sonic activities, particularly in British urban spaces like Madras or other places in the Madras Presidency.
What was the what? Sorry, Yasir, what was the?
No, the gender of this acoustic. So how I mean do we have instances where like women or women missionaries or those kind of activities coming and also creating a space for themselves in this the larger canvas of acoustics in the region of Madras or other places in the Madras Presidency.
Right. Yeah, no. So what you see, I think what with missionary history, what happens very often is that there is an overwhelming sort of focus on print and on literacy, and that is the focus of a lot of historical work on missionaries in the 19th and 20th century, especially when it comes to the Protestants, right? One recent exception is the work of Bani Bate, who actually talks about oratory and how that is linked to the formation of this a new kind of Tamil political modernity. But what I'm trying to, I think, argue is also is that the sonic becomes a site for it becomes a site of politics. It becomes a site where through which missionaries sort of position themselves in society, but also sort of it allowed them to act. It allowed them. It's a way in which allowed them to act, allowed them to proselytize, to organize themselves, and to classify the world around them. So that was what I was trying to do in this talk. And in order to do so, I think one thing that I found interesting is that a lot of the work that the archive that people have used to talk about missionary work is the sort of public archive of the mission, right? So people have looked at pamphlets and print literature which is circulating in a public, which the missionaries hope to convert. But there is this kind of more intimate archive, this letter, these letters, journals, correspondence between missionaries, right? Which give them a sense of purpose, which allow them to locate themselves in the colonies, which which allow them to position themselves vis-a-vis the colonial state very often. So it is in these texts that I've seen that the sonic becomes a key way through which they sort of articulate and express a sense of themselves, their mission, and also of their own sort of religious self-identity vis-a-vis all these other kinds of Christianities, but also obviously heathenism in the colonies. So, I mean, the question about gender, I'd have to think about. But thank you, Yasir.
Thank you. It's fantastic. Really appreciate it.
There's a question via Facebook. Sadhika Datta asks, thank you for a very informative talk, ma'am. Do you think there is an internal bias in the listener?
I mean, yes, of course. So that's the whole point, right? That I'm looking at sound not as a physiological phenomenon. So it's not just about hearing, but it's not just about listening, but about hearing, and how you hear, what you hear is conditioned by your own sort of intellectual, social, and political context. And so there is an internal bias, and I'm interested in how that sort of influences the way in which Protestants hear, and or Protestant missionaries hear, and how does that allow us to access their worldview? How does that allow us to think about the ways in which they function, the ways in which they go about their work in the early 19th century? So yes, there is a bias. In what way did the colonial state try and listen and regulate sounds? I think a lot of the problems that arose or a lot of the kind of encounters, the sonic encounters that I'm talking about, arose in a context where the colonial state itself saw itself as a mediator between different religious groups, right? And the Protestant missionaries felt that the Madras government should sort of explicitly regulate and control heathen noise, that it should explicitly control Roman Catholic festivals and feasts, etc. But the state was not willing to do so for a variety of reasons, right? That had to do with law and order, had to do with governance, had to do with its own sort of commercial prosperity, etc. in this early period. So what you see here is that it is the kind of reactions that these Protestant missionaries articulate in these texts about these sounds, their engagement with the sounds is in a context where the state sees itself as a mediator of sounds rather than trying to control and regulate them, and that is what you read in these texts, I think. So a lot of this is also about it's speaking to the ways in which these narratives are about. In a way, it's negotiating both with the Madras government, which sees itself as a sort of Christian guardian of this kind of multiracial, multi-religious community. So it's trying to negotiate these different communities, these different contentious religious communities, but it's also about the state, right? So it's communicating and negotiating with the state. So that's what I was trying to argue. How is it different from the missionaries' modus operandi? Again, I think I've answered that question. So, yeah. I found in the archives any comparisons of the Carnatic system of music with the Western system of classical music. In the case of visual archives, visual art styles of India are critiqued severely. Yeah, there is. I think for a later period, you have C.R. Day who compares, and William Jones as well, of course, who talks about Indian classical music, Carnatic music, and Hindustani music, and this comparison with the Western system of classical music, which is done, sort of pejoratively, but it's a sort of in-depth analysis. But here, the kind of the missionaries are actually fairly. They can be fairly appreciative of what they see as high culture, right? So it's basically their problem is with these sort of public expressions of sound and religiosity, these processions, etc., that they see as problematic. So you will, and even though sort of the dominant view is that all native sound is bad, that sound is compared sort of in a derogatory way to native sound is compared in a derogatory way to Christian sounds and to Western sounds. If you look at the archives itself, there is a certain kind of way in which the kind of sounds which are critiqued most of all are what they perceive to be what lower caste sounds, village festivals, temple festivals, sort of outward signs of religiosity.
I think there are no more questions on Facebook. Are there any more questions from people within this Zoom call? I think there are. Professor Farooqi,
if I can just see, very interesting, Aparna, and there are some reverberations of it in terms of some of the issues with regard to music and the pre-colonial, say two moments. One is the early 13th century, encounter of say Islam in Delhi with the rough music, rough music as it was identified, that the Hindu people are coming out in procession with a lot of drum beating and all kinds of noise, and they take the procession.
Always a problem, yeah.
They take the procession to Jamuna, and then they dip themselves, take bath in the Jamuna, and create all kinds of nuisance. So the ulama, then the custodians of Islam, and Delhi being the seat of the Caliph, represented by the Sultan, came to Sultan Iltutmish and complained that what kind of Islamic city it is that the Hindus are doing so much dhol baja here and making so much noise, literally rough music, and this is such a nuisance, and this must be stopped. So Iltutmish came up with a very interesting, and that is in terms of the responsibility of the political. Iltutmish came up with a very interesting proposition, telling the ulama that how we as Muslims are a very, very small community here compared to the large majority of the population here in the city, and therefore it is like something like salt in the meal. So Muslims are like salt in the meal. So when our population will increase, we might be in a position to stop this rough music of these kafirs, hidden people. Now, so this was one moment, and the other I'm remembering with reference to Ines Zubanov's book on disputed mission, 17th century Tamil country. And this is before the Portuguese have actually taken over. Yeah. So this is pre-colonial, and the state is not supporting the Jesuit missionaries. And there are disputes within that also in terms of how to deal with the locals. There's a Brahminical knowledge and Jesuit mission, and there were difficulties. So which I understand by the time the city is taken over by the colonial regime, internal disputations with regard to the heathens can be taken care of, etc. So there is perhaps a longer history of these, contestations. Maybe in the 13th century, say Muslim-Hindu encounter, and in the 16th, 17th century Tamil country, in terms of the Jesuit mission not being successful enough in terms of the Brahminical resistance, perhaps. So, I mean, these are the general things. These are the things which are coming to my mind listening to your, as I said, reverberations.
Yeah, thank you, Razi. That was very interesting. And the fact is that there's a long history of the representation of Hindu music, these processions and temple music, etc., as rough music, right? Of course. What is interesting about the Protestant texts is, and I mean, British Orientalists themselves, there's a whole bunch of travel literature which will talk about this music and these scenes, etc. I think what is interesting about the missionary texts is that there is a way in which it's not just about the representation of this music as alien and rough and sort of unmelodic, etc. But it's also about this element, this idea of transformation, right? So how does one replace and change one kind of sound with another kind of sound. And it's not just music, it's all kinds of sounds. So it's the sound of the bell, the sound of the organ, the sound of preaching. So it's very much about sort of how the Christian sounds have to replace these other kinds of sounds. So there's always in the critique the potential for salvation, right? So which makes it different from the kind of travel accounts that you have by by British travelers and all of that. And again, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is to think about sound in non-musical ways, right? It's always, and Abhijit asked me a similar question about music, and obviously there's a long history of a very complicated kind of relationship with music that you have and with Christian populations in South India. So the Jesuits would, the Catholics used and continued to use music, heathen music in their ceremonies and rituals and their practices. And so did the Lutherans, right? The Lutherans did it in a sort of pragmatic way. They felt that this was the only way in which they could continue with their activities, with proselytization and with the guardianship and care of these native populations. It's when the Anglicans came around that then the issue became a really sort of heated one, because there's a particular contingent which believed that all music should be, all heathen music should be thrown out. So this question about how far is the music itself, how far does it represent religion, becomes an important question. For the Catholics, you could be Christian, but you could use, and this is of course the case in Europe as well, you could, in many contexts, so you could native music, instruments, sort of the pageantry and pomp, native pageantry and pomp could be incorporated into your own ceremonies, and it did not reduce your religiosity in any way, right? For the Protestants, it's different. And so even as different kinds of Christians used music and in their day-to-day functioning, the meaning of that usage also changed, So it is a long history, as you say. But the significance of the use of native music in Christianity changes over time, and I'm trying to look at it at a particular moment in the early 19th century. Oh, okay. I just wanted to know the challenges that scholars would face while dealing and retrieving this history of the song, what kind of mastery it demands. So I think that is the biggest challenge, because when you look at when you want to do the history of sound or a sonic history before recording technology, basically you have to look at the written text in order to retrieve the sonic. Right? And you have to basically look at narratives that sort of capture the sonic, that capture sound, narrative accounts. So that's the real sort of, you have to rethink. So as I began my talk by saying that when I started this project, I went back to the very same kind of records that I use in my work on urban history and legal history, etc. So I looked at these records, but with a new eye, and I realized that sound as a site as a site of politics is so ubiquitous in these records. So it really means not just that you have to think about different kinds of archives, but you really have to think about your archive differently and take the sonic seriously. So that, I think, you have to find sound, you have to think about the authorship of these narratives, contextualize the sound as it sort of comes up in these records. So it's really about thinking about your archive differently. It's not about finding the more and more original primary source.
If we're done with questions, I think perhaps we can move to Professor Farooqi. Any concluding remarks you would like to make?
Are there any more questions or observations from the audience? Okay. Thank you so much, Aparna.
Oh, you're most welcome.
And since you were speaking in response to Nagwan's question about what kind of source, the way you've used your sources, I think it's what really interested me was the fact, as I said earlier, the detail in which information was recorded in the documents which you cited. And I think you've shown us how to use this archive in a very different kind of way. And I'm really grateful to you for that. Now, since this was, you're referring to the Protestant soundscape, I was reminded of Luther's own sort of concern about the acoustic space, which the church as an acoustic space, and which goes back to Luther himself. And given the emphasis on the spoken word,
Yeah.
Luther very particular. Luther, and this very specific. It's a very specific Protestant concern. Not so much Catholics, and I think it also tells us something about why Catholics were the Roman Catholics were much more accommodative, much more eclectic, because this was not something that really bothered them as much as it did the Protestants. And Luther, for instance, for him, speech intelligibility and the reception of the sermon was something which was extremely important, and therefore that the person who's delivering the sermon must be placed at a point where he faces both the altar as well as the congregation, and also is located at a point where the sound can be heard and it is intelligible. So I think that emphasis on the sermon, on the reception of the sermon remained important. Of course, I mean, I don't know much about the subject, but apparently many of Luther's own ideas about the way in which the church the inner space of the church should be redesigned weren't incorporated by the Lutherans, or maybe if they were, maybe that was much later. I'm not really sort of familiar with this, but as far as the Anglicans are concerned, they were even more rigorous in their sort of attitude towards both the sermon as well as as well as church music. And Christopher Wren, after the Great Fire, designed a large number of churches in London, which were supposed to be, which were smaller, precisely because the idea was that the rector could be heard clearly. So that was an important concern for him. It's not grandeur, it's the smallness of the space and close attention again to acoustics. As for the Calvinists, they represented another extreme where, in fact, some of them were very strongly opposed to church organs, church music, even in the early Calvinists smashing church organs, along with, of course, images and so on. So that was a very different kind of attitude. So again, for them, it's not music, it's the word that remained so important. And the period that you're talking about, again, so coming back to Anglicans, Scottish Church. This is a period also of a lot of this attention to detail also comes out of their own sort of attempt to compile a lot of church music. So then early 19th century and perhaps also late 18th century, there's then lots of compilations. In fact, they get reflected in some of the writings of Walter Scott also, this effort to put together a lot of these this church music, biographies of composers of church of hymns and psalms. So you have a lot of these compilations being published. So obviously there are large number of people reading these, and they require a kind of specialist knowledge of music, of notation, and so on. So I think that also is reflected again in their own the attention they are paying to what natives, the way natives their instruments, sound, music, bells, processions, and so on. I had in this context a question also. Do you have some can you share with us some of the whether there are sources which might shed some light on the response of the natives to the church, church sounds of the church or church music, and other sort of sounds associated with the church, because again, it's the unfamiliar. So for the native, it is unfamiliar. For these missionaries, this is unfamiliar. So how do they respond to the unfamiliar? If you permit me, just something in the context of what Nagwan said, I think it's important again on the way Aparna has used these sources, that this what kind of mastery you require. I think it also depends on what aspect you are really looking at, because music, if you're looking at music, I think it requires a certain understanding of music. It's specialized knowledge of that, and you can't really make much progress without that. Or if you're interested in architecture or the way in which spaces are designed, you would require some understanding of architecture, of at least physical laws of acoustics. So I think it would also depend on what you're looking for, what aspect you're looking for, and then of course you go searching for sources accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you. That's actually really useful and interesting. I'll just quickly respond. So, and one of the things that I want to do as I take this project further is to read much more about acoustics and think about think about the fact that this this sonic encounter is not entirely constructed, right? So there is something that and it's the interaction between the physiological and the sonic that one has to and the physical that one has to really think about. Okay, so the missionary archive. So one thing that I wanted to say is that this question of the preaching, the sermon, etc., not just the content of the sermon, but how you preach, how you speak, how do you sort of attract the attention of these potential native converts. All of these things is very, very important to the Anglicans, to the Protestant missionaries. And I found all this really interesting material on preaching and on taking care of the throat, on voice modulation, also on not just speaking in church itself, but where to speak, right? So whether you should speak in a mailard, should you speak in an open field, in a marketplace, and which has to do with sound, right? Where is your voice best heard? How do you catch the attention of natives? How do you treat your throat if you have a problem? What do you drink and eat in order to? So there are all sorts of So there's all sorts of sort of advice for young missionaries who are coming into to South India for the first time. There are these manuals which are written, which are really about preaching, and which are not just about the content of these sermons. It is really about how to use the voice, right? And why the voice is so important. And interestingly, what these manuals would do, and this is what I mean by when I say that there's a whole genre of this kind of literature from within, as opposed to which says that, look, writing is all very well, print is all very well, but it's about how you speak is the most important thing, right? How you speak, how you preach, that is the most important thing, how your voice is heard. And there's also all this sort of I found this material on Christian physiology, on Christian medicine, which is about the hearing ear, right? So which brings together kind of biology and Christianity together, because the ear and the eardrum and care of the eardrum, it's a sort of it's important, but it's also important because it is only through the ear that you apprehend, that you understand the word of Christ, etc. So there's also this at this time. It's very interesting. The whole question of acoustics is very interesting, and so not just the acoustics of churches in towns, but also they're talking about how the missionary about the acoustics of these smaller churches in villages and towns across South India, right? And again, there's a lot of material on the bell, and how the bell brings people together, and different kinds of bells and the different kinds of noises that they make, etc. So this I want to look at this question of acoustics, the importance of preaching, the sermon, the voice, as opposed to the sermon itself, the content of the sermon. All of that I would like to sort of think about. And I'll talk to you more about the Luther and Christopher Wren and the churches in England, etc. About the response of the natives, I mean, it's a very sort of important question, of course, and it's something that I really have to think about. What I do have is, for instance, what I've looked at is the reactions of Indian Christians from that time. So for instance, Vedanayaka Sastriyar, who was the court poet of Tanjavur, and he's somebody who's very upset because people like Renius are coming to replace the older Lutherans, right? And he wants to continue to use Tamil customs, and he wants to continue to retain caste, but also retain Tamil music, and he would set this to obviously Christian lyrics, etc. But the interesting thing is that someone like Sastriyar, who is upper caste, he will make distinctions between different kinds of instruments. Certain kinds of drums, for instance, are considered low caste, and whereas other kinds of instruments are considered sort of all right to keep in Christian worship and prayer. So there's a certain kind of classification of instruments that people like Sastriyar do. But so it is basically through these upper caste Indian Christians that I'm trying to think about this question of reception. But for this early period, I don't really know, for instance, how one would think about how do native Christians, low caste native Christians respond to organ music, or one would have to see where one could find that kind of material. So, but it's an important question. So, but thank you. That was very useful. Yeah.
Thank you, Aparna.
Okay.
I think we can conclude this talk now. I thank Professor Balachandran and Professor Faruqi for their time and this amazing talk. I thank everyone on the Zoom meeting, and also everyone watching this on Facebook for being here and engaging with the talk. I invite all of you to the next talk, which will be by Professor Tamara Sears from Rutgers University, and the topic is Surveying Narco Routes, the Entangled Histories of Opium and Archaeology in Colonial Central India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. Thank you, Amar, and everybody else.